with me as always is my amazing co-host, Donna Karlin. Donna, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, other than a little bit of a raspy voice, but that's because Ray tells me I talk too much. What could I say? And I'm doing great. Thank you. And
You
you?
you have that smoky, mysterious voice going on today, so I think
Yeah.
listeners are going to dig it for sure. So, so what are we talking about today?
So, um, what I'd like to look at is advice. Not all advice is good advice. So keep what you need and toss the rest. And there's many different connotations to this because people give unsolicited advice,
Yep.
give us advice that we ask for. We don't necessarily agree with it. So how do we deal with that? Because we don't want to in any way, shape, or form damage a relationship. And sometimes when you don't take somebody's advice, they take it personally, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you respond to that? And how do you take advice that really rubs you the wrong way? And when I say toss it, I mean toss it. Because what we tend to do as humans is we take in what that person says, we argue with it internally,
Yeah.
and rather than toss it, we let it stay with us and it just ferments and it just churns within us and gets us angrier or more disappointed. And we don't let go of it. And if we're
Yep.
not going to accept it, why in the world would we hold on to it? So I think that this is a really good conversation to have because we often ask people, what do you think? What is your advice to me within this context?
Hmm.
Then they share something and then we start arguing with them because we don't agree with it. How do we look at the little nuggets within that, and rather than argue with it, say to them, help me understand why you think that's the best way for me to go, and at least go deeper before you discard it. So I just wanted to throw that out and ask you, where have you seen that happen, or where has somebody asked you for advice and then they argue with you every step of the way?
Yeah, well, I mean, you probably experienced that with every coaching client you've ever had, right? At the end
Sure.
of the day, I would say, that like you said, I mean, you set it up a couple of different ways, a couple of different scenarios. There's the unsolicited advice, which I think you're free to ignore. If I didn't ask you for your opinion, I don't really need to hear it. And I say that kind of loosely, but I think people put more effort into that than they really need to. It's coming from a place where somebody feels like they get an opportunity to stick their nose in, maybe where it doesn't belong, and you don't have to be rude about it, but you have to say, well, that's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to go back and think about that. I may or may not take advantage of what you suggest, but I appreciate you sharing. It means that you care, and you kind of at least acknowledge them for sticking their nose in. And so, unsolicited advice, I think, is pretty easy to to work around and cascade. Although, coming back to that, will that other person have their feelings hurt or get offended if you don't take advantage of it? I think you sort of set that in motion by saying, I really want to consider it, but whether I take advantage of that or follow your suggestion or not, I want to tell you thank you for sharing. And so you've respected them enough to at least acknowledge whatever their contribution was. I think probably from the other aspect is when people want to ask for advice, a lot of times you don't want to hear what you probably are going to hear. And people get ready for a fight. Even if I asked you for the advice, what do you think about this? I really want to try and somehow utilize it as a reason to justify why I'm doing something or not doing something. And I want to, sort of put on the boxing gloves and get ready to, to spar over it. And it's kind of weird because I think human behavior is unique. We have this tendency to want to either have that fight or flight reaction in those situations. And when we dig in and decide we want to fight, it's like, well, you asked me, right? You asked me for this advice. You asked me for my perspective, and now you're spending all this time justifying why you do or not do what you do. And those can be somewhat challenging because I think we've been in those situations where people act like they really want you to sort of help guide and direct them, give you your perspective from an honest, authentic place. And then when you do and you get a negative reaction to it, it also creates that tension, and in a lot of people's responses, well, now they want to dig in and fight and tell, well, if it was if it was working so great for you, Donna, why did why are you even talking to me about it? Now it's on. Now we're gonna trade blows over it. Not literally, but verbal sparring over why you're right or I'm right, or why you're wrong and I'm more right. So those things I think always get a little bit crazy. I think when you can separate yourself from, hey, I'm going to share a perspective and I'm going to be honest based on what information I have in front of me today. This advice is yours, free to take it or not take it, but I am not going to put any other investment other than what I'm going to share. I'm not going to take it personally if you don't take advantage of it. I'm not going to be offended if you say that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Feel free to do that. And I think you let yourself off. You get your get out of jail free card emotionally when you can allow yourself to say, I'm going to say my piece and I'm going to be done and I'm going to push it off. And I think for the receiver, it's a different perspective in terms of how you receive it in, but you also have to be willing to take everybody's perception or excuse me, their perspective, and be willing to think about it, not be reactionary to it. So that's a long answer for a short question, but there's so many different ways to weave this in. There's so many different scenarios that this could play out.
Yeah,
That's why it's kind of an interesting topic to explore.
it is. And, advice is almost like a double edged sword. Because sometimes, even if people give us advice that we agree with, we don't necessarily act on it.
Yeah.
And then we beat ourselves up, and that's another vicious circle. It's fascinating, though, because advice is out there from so many different perspectives, from so many different people, and or not people, like technology. We could get advice from many different sources. Um, the question is, how do you triage it? Because a lot of people will reach out to multiple sources to get their opinion on a certain approach to something, and they'll get conflicting pieces of advice.
Yeah.
Do this, do that. I was just sharing the other day with a friend of mine when I went to the Philadelphia airport and I asked for advice as to whether or not I should take the shuttle or a taxi downtown from the airport. And there were two people at the help desk, a male and a female. And the male said, take the shuttle, and the female said, take a cab at the exact same time. And I'm going, that is not helpful. And I said, could you confer and actually come up with one? So they started debating it in front of me. I'm going, that is still not helpful. And they just started laughing. And then I said, okay, share your rationale behind each. This is the help desk. Like, it was a riot. And he said, well, the shuttle is cheaper. And she said, no, taxis have a flat rate. So it's not going to be any more expensive. And then she said, if the shuttle's downtown, you have to wait for it to come all the way back to the airport because it goes in a circular motion. So you're probably better off to take a taxi because you'll get there faster. So he said, okay, good point. So they came to consensus and I took a taxi going downtown. The process, though, of having that conversation was actually funny. And I knew that I pick one or the other because I would get downtown, whether or not I took the shuttle or the taxi. It just mattered, how quickly I could get there. And that's just a mild example. When somebody asks for advice for our life, for our careers, what is it that we can do? Because we could only give advice, remember, based on our personal experience or something that we've personally witnessed that seemed to work for somebody. So when we give that advice, it's usually based on something concrete.
Yeah.
It's not a hypothetical kind of advice. If you're doing ideation and percolating on possible ways forward, then you could just throw everything in the pot. There's no specific right or wrong, really. With asking for advice, you're asking for somebody to give you direction. That's different. And depending on what they've witnessed, remember, it might work,
Hmm.
to it might not work. In which case, don't hold that person to account if something didn't work as well as they'd experienced it before, because there's always many other factors that you're not privy to. And that person has had many experiences that they're bringing into the equation that they hadn't shared with you.
Well,
So,
you bring up a really good point, though. I think that's important for our listeners to comprehend is you get the advice and you solicited it, you get the advice and it doesn't work. Human nature actually then insists that we put the blame on somebody else for our failure. I see that all the time, right? Where people like,
yes.
well, Donna told me to do that and it didn't work. And see, Donna, it didn't work. And I knew it wasn't going to work, but I followed your advice. And then, so people have this tendency to make it super personal, especially if it doesn't work, but you have to be willing to consider, you have the red pill or the blue pill, and Donna says to take the blue pill. I'm going to feel better and it's going to, make a huge difference. And I take the blue pill and it doesn't work. I always think, if you put that statement on the advice, like, feel free not to follow this, but based on what I know and the experience I have, this is what I would suggest. You are free to make your own decisions, but I want to make sure that that if it doesn't work, that's an option. Now that's a potential outcome. I don't want you to hold it against me because that could affect our relationship. And so I've actually seen people be really masterful at sort of actually getting out of the conversation where people are seeking their advice because they know that the damage that can be caused when things don't work can be significant, and they don't want to be held to account for that because it's not really their responsibility. They're giving an opinion, a perspective, and like you said, there's many other factors. And so I think it's whether you're giving the advice or you're asking for the advice, it's an important aspect to figure out how to set the ground rules for how the advice is going to be used point forward, or how you want it to be used if you're giving it.
So does that mean that, the book that you got me to write or spurred me on to write, if it's not a bestseller, I could go back and blame you?
You could. I didn't necessarily say you need to write this book. I just said, hey, look, this would make a great book. That you took that as, yeah, it would make a great book. So I'm going to go. So it was different than advice. I mean, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, yeah, but it will be a bestseller. So no problem. I just want my royalty checks if it is.
I was just kidding. I remember that conversation. I want to read your book on questions. I don't have a book on questions. Well, what are you waiting for? That was pretty much the entire conversation. So, that's the other thing. It's fascinating how we take what people say and a snippet of it, and we use that for direction. And I could tell you in my life, at least 50% of the opportunities that have come to light was because somebody like you said, well, what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
Or like, why don't you do this? And that is like an indirect form of advice. Whether or not I hold on, like take it, like you said, it was just a
Yeah.
suggestion. And then I just ran with it. That happens every day, though, in our lives. How often do people say, this was amazing, why don't you do more of it? Which is a form of advice. And you could either hold on to that and say, you know what, I really do this well. Why not? Don't I do more of it? Or totally discount what they said and toss it, which isn't going to serve you. There's the opposite of, take the advice that you need, toss the rest.
Yeah.
People end up tossing advice that they get that they really shouldn't be tossing. This is a complicated conversation. It's a complicated topic. It's not black and white.
No, it's not. And it is one of those things that I think if you're not cognizant of it, then it can it can create a lot of internal conflict. Like whether you're
Yes.
the advice giver or the advice receiver, and it can create a whole lot of noise, right? I see this in startup entrepreneurs all the time. They'll tell anybody who will listen about their idea, but they will hear, several negative opinions about the product or the service, the idea. And now they got to change this, change that, bad color, bad logo, stupid name, whatever. And they get to a point where everybody that shows up has an opinion. And the opinion all of a sudden now is the one foremost thing that they need to do next, to do differently.
Mhm.
And before you know it, you've lost control of your idea because you've been, sort of shifting with the wind so quickly. And then you don't have any identity. And I see that whether it's in a startup environment, but I also see it in leadership style. I see it in how people communicate, how people interact, how they build their personal or their professional brand. They take whatever the latest opinion or advice is in front of them and take it to as gospel and carry that forward until somebody interjects and says and shares something new. And really, at the end of the day, there's no shortage of opinions out there for what you are doing right and what you're doing wrong. If you ask enough people, they'll tell you both sides of that coin. And so you have to be really cognizant of who you're asking or soliciting the advice from. And then you have to be really cognizant of what's my criteria for evaluating what that advice is.
Mhm.
Not being reactionary, but literally, like you said, throwing it into the pot, deciding, okay, out of all of these things that I've heard, these are two or three of the nuggets that I think I can take away and I can really leverage. But I'm not holding any one person accountable for it. This is really still my responsibility to execute or build on or do what I need to do. But at the end of the day, everything else I need to be able to just set aside so that it doesn't add to the cloudiness and confusion.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm just fascinated to like to hear from our listeners because in this case, what really intrigues me is when do people don't listen to advice, they toss it, and further down the road, they remember that piece of advice and give themselves a two by four to the side of the head. Why didn't I listen to this person? Or when did they get advice that they followed and it took them down a really horrible path? And what did they do about it? What was the feedback they gave, if any, to that person rather than, approach them with angst? Instead, say, I listened, this is how I executed it, and it didn't work for me. However, I did learn something from it, and this is what I learned. So you're giving them feedback. So the next time they're asked for advice in something similar, they're going to remember that feedback and
Yeah.
actually include it in the conversation. This is not a finite conversation to have with anybody. This really is a great conversation to have on an ongoing basis, to check in, let somebody know who gave you advice that was good advice, what you did with it. And every time I've done that, even when Michael was younger and somebody gave him advice as to what to do in his career, what he did with it, I actually shared 20 years later with the person who gave the advice. He was over the moon that I shared it because these things go into a black hole. And people who share their wisdom with you and mean like with the best intentions, obviously, rarely hear what happened with it. So that's the last thing I want to leave our audience with. If you do get advice that's worked for you or not worked for you, close the loop and go back to that person and
Yeah.
say, "This is what happened. Thank you so much. It worked and I'm over the moon," or it didn't work. However, it was an extraordinary learning experience. And if I didn't take that route, I would not ultimately come full circle and be doing what I'm doing now. Whatever it is, continue that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The other thing I would say to add to that would be, even if it didn't work, still thank them for the time that they took to
Yeah.
give you their perspective. There's a root behind the word advisor, right? The other aspect I would say is when you look at this, when you get good advice, or even if you don't get good advice, it didn't work, but it was something that was worth trying or doing, and you swung for the fences and it didn't work out, and that's okay. if
Yeah.
it if it was still rooted in good standing, and the person behind it had some good I want to use the word advice again, but really some good methodology and approach in terms of why they're giving you this advice. They've got experience and they're not making any guarantees, but they're seriously offering some strong knowledge and experience that may or may not
Right.
work out for you, right? Those folks become sort of the people that you really need to bring into your inner circle. They become your advisors for the future because they can be such tremendous resources. I think that, that's another thing. And I'm the relationship guy. So I'm all about how do I collect that, those core wisdom folks into my network that I might need in a pinch, or, run into a situation. So at the end of the day, those are the things that I would just leave with our audience, that make sure that, don't make it a one-off. Let them know how much you appreciated it. Let them know that you might call on them again, and just thank them for their time, their energy, and their wisdom.
Exactly. I really look forward to hearing from them.
Excuse me.
Used.
I muted myself before I coughed, but I got all choked up over that. So,
Ah,
so at the end of the day, we would love to hear from our audience what they are taking away from this topic. So, Donna, how can they get engaged in this topic, this conversation, or share with us their thoughts on this or any of our episodes?
join our Facebook group, Inquiring Minds with Donna, Karlin, and Steve Harper. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's many ways for you to get involved. Our Facebook page is really great because it gives you the platform to share your 3 cents and comments and reflections on our shows. And we really, really appreciate it. Sometimes our listeners give us topics to speak about. And I love when that happens because we just chat and share our perspectives, and hopefully it'll give them a nugget to take away and actually use. Or, like we're talking about today, take that advice and just toss it in the trash can. Either way, we'd love to hear what you do with it.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, we'll be back again with another episode of Inquiring Minds. But until then, Donna, have a great rest of your day.
You too.